And the focus today is going to be on managing devices that we're connected to. So, we're connected to the console port of your routers and switches and firewalls and such. And not only, I mean, that lets us give you access to that equipment, and usually, you guys will be, dialing into the Uplogix and troubleshooting and fixing things. But our software does a lot on top of that, and so we're going to talk about that today. When you're on our command line, once you've connected to the Uplogix, you can navigate around to the different ports, and each port is logically separated from the others and has its own file directory and so forth. So when you're looking to work with a device that's connected to the serial port, the first serial port on the Uplogix, that's going to be port 1/1. And so yeah, just easy to do. And then once you're on that particular port, you can use the terminal command to actually connect to the console port of that device, and router, switch, whatever it might be. Now at that point, you're gonna need to enter your own. You're gonna need to log into the device itself. Usually there's some sort of console username and password set for these network devices. And so, once you terminal in, we connect to the console, but then you'll need to usually log into those devices themselves. And there's a little bit of a wrinkle to that, in that, when we configure our advanced drivers, they will use a username and password to log in. So there's a way that you can set up the Uplogix such that it leaves you logged in with that account. But in our experience, most people really want to have users logging in themselves when they actually get to the console, just for accountability purposes, pretty much. When you're in the terminal, that tilde, that sideways S right there, that's the tilde. That's our control character. And so, if you hit tilde and then hit enter, that'll take you back out of the terminal. Of course, you can use that terminal command whether or not the port's configured. If we don't have the port configured, we call that native mode, and that's just kind of a dumb terminal, as opposed to the advanced drivers that we'll talk about what they do in terms of automation and backups here in the next couple slides. And then there's another command that's really nice, the terminal shadow, which lets you watch what's happening on a port as it's happening, and that could be useful when you're first configuring these ports, and you want to make sure everything is working properly with our software. Or you can also kind of watch somebody else while they're doing stuff on a port using that terminal shadow command. So that's a real useful subcommand there for that. So once you've logged into the Uplogix, dialed in or SSH, doesn't really matter. You get the command line either way. And then if you want to work on a particular device, you switch to that port. Just type the port number, and then type terminal there, and it'll pop you into the console connection. You've got, while you're in there, the tilde is our control character, and that'll give you access to some commands while you're in there. So now, of course, different devices might be talking at different baud rates. So if you ever need to adjust the baud rate, you can do that from our command line. Just type config serial, and that'll let you set those however you need to. Some, most Cisco stuff is going to use the defaults, 9600 8N1, almost everything you run into. But every so often there's a weirdo device out there that, only talks at, 19200 baud, or, needs flow control turned on. So you can, configure those types of serial settings in here with config serial. This can also be useful when you're troubleshooting a device if you don't seem to have a console connection to it. Like if you terminal to a device and you don't get anything, show serial here. Some of this data here is going to give you a clue as to whether or not we've got a connection. In the middle there, you see it's got DSR and CTS. Those are control signaling. That's part of the serial protocol. And so if you see those true, then we almost certainly have a good console connection. And then also RX and TX, that's just a byte count of received and transmit, but that's also useful if those aren't incrementing at all, then yeah, probably the console's unplugged, or maybe the baud rate's wrong, right? So um, now, if you recall, there's also a way to do this automatically. If you need to try to auto-detect the serial, the baud settings, you can use the detect -v. It'll try all the different bit rates until and basically press enter until it gets back something that looks like text. So that's pretty reliable, and if you give it the -v, it'll kind of show you everything it does as it's doing it. While you're in that terminal session working on the command line of the device, there are a bunch of different commands you can access using that same tilde character, right? If you hit tilde-H, it shows you your help menu, but then you have options to do things like send a break signal, turn on a local echo. If the device isn't showing you what you type, you can do that. And then you can also manually start up file servers if you need to push some files and you want to do it manually instead of letting our software do it. You can open up, you can start a FTP file server, SFTP, SCP, and TFTP as well, so that you can push OS images and so forth when you need to. Um, Also, a kind of useful command, tilde-L, that'll lock the port. Instead of logging you out and letting our automation pick up its jobs again, it'll log you out, but it'll stop anything else from happening on that port. And other users need to have proper permission to unlock the port. So that can be good when you've got a device that's updating or something and you want to make sure nobody messes with it for the next hour or whatever. Um, so that's when you're using the terminal itself. Now, we've talked a little bit about native versus the advanced drivers here. And the native driver, that gives you remote access. You can console in. We do logging. We keep a record of everything that happens on that console port. But other than that, we don't. Our software doesn't really do anything. But if you use our advanced drivers, which we have developed quite a number of them, and they let you do or they let you automate some things. So we have a bunch of different monitors that we can run. We can look at CPU and memory. We can look at network interfaces. We do, backups of your configuration and your operating systems, so that we have copies of those stored locally, ready to be pushed back down to the device if need be. Um, and then because we're pulling those configs, we can tell when there's been a change. So we can do change logging. We can let you know when we see changes, and we'll let you know who made them. Uh, and then we also have a feature called surgical rollback. That's part of configuration management, where if you turn that on, it will make you commit any changes, and if you don't, then it will automatically roll them back. And that's just one of those safety net kind of features we have that you can turn on if you want. A little bit more, we also have this driver that we call enhanced, and that driver can basically be taught how to log in and out of devices. So if you ever have a device that you want to do some management and backups and automation on, that's not a Cisco, it's not a Juniper, it's not something we've seen before, we do have this driver available for that, and so it's very flexible for that type of thing. So yeah, as Anthony was just saying, when you want to configure one of these ports, we basically tell it, hey, this is a Cisco, and this is that dialog. This slide's a little busy, but basically you run a command on that port, config init. That's short for initialize, and it's going to ask you a bunch of questions. Make, right? Native is the default, but if you hit question mark, it shows you all the different options. And of course, one of those is Cisco. That's what we choose. And then if you look on the right, that dialog continues. You can give it the model, but it'll automatically detect some of this stuff, so you don't necessarily need to. And depending on the device, you might have to provide, which flavor of operating system it's using, right? For Cisco, there's a couple of different potential choices, whether you're on a Nexus or mostly it's iOS for Cisco's, but and then continuing through the dialog, we give it an IP address. This is us just telling the Uplogix what the IP of this router is. So mainly we use that just to transfer files back and forth between that device. So this is informational. And usually that's going to be the IP of the router's management interface. That's what we're going to use to do those backup and recovery file transfer operations mainly. So then, you get the option to configure dedicated Ethernet if you have that. Probably mostly you guys aren't going to be. And then it wants to have a username and password to use to log in. Once you give it that username and password, including the enable password if it's separate, you have the option to change the baud rate if you need to, just like if you're in the config serial menu. And then once you commit those changes, it's going to go ahead and do a bunch of tests. It logs in, makes sure that it sees the login prompt and that it's able to use that username to get a connection to that device. And once it logs in, it's basically going to run a show version and collect some information. We're gonna pick up its what version of software it's running. We're going to pick up its serial number, uptime, things like that. That we're going to just kind of monitor continuously. And then, sometimes the driver will turn off buffered logging just so that we don't have log messages popping up and confusing the driver. And then it will also try to schedule some jobs. In the case of the Cisco driver, it's going to try to back up your OS image, your startup config, and your running config. And if it's able to do those during this initial test, then it schedules those to happen on a recurring basis, every 3 hours, every day, every 2 weeks, as the case may be. And then finally, it will schedule a chassis monitor just so that it can monitor CPU and memory on that device. So basically, once you run through this configuration dialog, it's going to sit there and run through a bunch of tests and give you output about success or failure on that. And so we'll get into that in the labs here in just a minute. Once the port's configured, we create a directory structure for managing those files. Each port gets its own directory so that you've got your separate running configs and OSs for each device that we're managing. If you need to look at those, show directory or show dir -b will give you a listing of them with byte count and dates and so forth. And on those configurations, you can see here we've got 4 archives in this example. Basically, every time the configuration changes, current becomes previous, previous becomes archive 1, and archive on down to archive 20. So you can have about 25 different versions of the running config backed up in here historically. That's also where we put any show text that you pull, and anytime the router boots up, we'll actually record that so that you've got an artifact if you need to refute it. Once you've got those files, you can do different things. You can actually just look at the running config if you want to in there, right? Show will just show you your, the contents of the startup or running config or any of those text files, right? You can also do a show diff if you want to compare 2 of them. What's the difference between my current running config and my golden standard, right? You can review that on the command line. Show tech will actually have it pull. It'll do a pull tech on the device and record it for you so that you can send that along to Cisco if you need to or whoever. And then you can also use the copy command to move files around. You can transfer them over the network or onto a USB drive or even up and down from the control center's file archive, just using that copy command. So that's good if you need to get an OS image over to a different device. You can always copy it from one port to another. So we're also able to push and pull those files, right? So the OS images, our driver knows how to push and pull configs in OS images for Cisco's and Juniper's and devices like that. So, if you have a candidate OS image, you need to do an update on a system, that's out of compliance. You just copy the file to the Uplogix port, and then you can say push OS just right there on the command line, and it will log into the device, it'll copy the file over for you, it'll change the configuration register, and then it'll reboot the router or switch to take that, to make it go into effect, make it go live right away. And same with the configurations. We have our software knows how to push and pull those configurations. So, if you ever need to, push a configuration snippet out, maybe you're updating TACAX servers across a bunch of devices or something like that, new hostname standards. You can push those files out using the Uplogix and just a simple push, config candidate. So once we have those advanced drivers in place, we will automatically back up your configuration at the start and end of each user session. And that feeds a couple of other features like the optional surgical rollback feature, right? If you don't commit your changes, then it will undo them. That also feeds our change logging, so you can know who did what. Now, so yeah, for a lot of devices, our Cisco driver will automatically attempt to push an OS image or the startup configuration if they're missing. And we'll actually do this in a lab here once we get through the slides. And it's automatic. So, if you've got a router that just has bad flash and it reboots and it comes up without a startup config, our software will detect that, and it'll take your last backup startup and it'll push it down to the device and try and get it back into an operational state. That can be useful both for, when there's a problem with existing equipment, or if you have to replace something, you can just cable up a brand new router or switch. The Uplogix will see that it's the same model, but it has no startup config, and we'll take the last startup config and just automatically re-provision that switch. We call that bare metal restore, and that's a great feature for when you have to replace equipment that's died in the field. We also have this feature called standard OS policies, where you can define in the control center a standard OS that you upload into the control center there. Once you define that policy, which that involves basically setting a standard OS image that matches certain devices. So you might say, all my 3800 switches need to be running this OS image. Then once you configure that policy, the Uplogix control center and local managers will automatically push out that OS image to the Uplogix file directories, and if you want, it will even update the routers and switches automatically. But the first step is to just stage that file. And if it doesn't match, if we have devices out of compliance, they will generate an alarm so that you can find them and decide if you want to, update them right away or, during a change window or whatever. Like I said, this mostly lives in the control center. Basically, you can configure this either for an individual local manager or at the group level. And the group level is probably, the very root group is the place that makes the most sense for this. And yeah, you basically select which make and model. You can give it a start date if you want. And then, pick which image you want to use for that standard OS and the policy action. It can either just be alarm, or it can be alarm and recover, as in update that OS image automatically. So this is getting into some of the details about how we do file transfers between the Uplogix and the different devices. We mentioned the dedicated Ethernet, which, that is a dedicated network connection between the Uplogix and, your router or your switch. And that's a great option because, it's available no matter what else is going on with your network. but mostly the way we transfer files is over the management LAN. So the Uplogix is on your management network, and hopefully it's able to reach your routers and switches so that it can push and pull those files, right? And so that's earlier in the configuration, and that's where we entered an IP address for the device. That's where we define, where those files are going to be coming from. And if we don't have dedicated Ethernet, then yeah, that's what we use to push and pull those files, is just the management LAN. And this is where you would configure that, right? In this example of configuring it, we gave it that management IP. That's probably the router's management port. But then also, it looks like we've also configured a dedicated Ethernet port, where you basically create a one-to-one network between the Uplogix and the device that it can use for those file transfers. And it'll preference that direct connection if it can. There are further kind of fiddly settings that you can configure if you need to. Config settings at the port level or in the control center will let you configure how it transfers files. So, the default, it's going to try X modem and then fail over to TFTP. You could change those so that it uses SFTP and then fails over to FTP instead. Just whatever is works for your devices. A lot of devices don't support X modem these days, so um, same with the OS image pushing. You've got some preferenceable options there, and some preferences in terms of how to handle the router when it reboots and that sort of thing. For the most part, you shouldn't have to mess with these unless for some reason you can't transfer files using a particular method. And like I said, these exist in the control center, and that's probably where you really want to set those. If you have a widespread need to use SFTP instead of X modem, then it's best to set that in the inventory group level so that it can be inherited to the local managers. Now this is best practices. So this is just kind of some things we've learned over the years, configuring devices and when you're first hooking them up. This is really what we recommend. Now, first of all, you've got to connect the console connection, right? That's usually a straight Ethernet cable, but some devices have weird console ports that you need an adapter for potentially. But once you've got it cabled up, we really recommend that you just first try to terminal into the device. Make sure that you can get access to its command line and that console connection seems like it's active and good. If you're not seeing a response from a device, we do recommend trying the detect command. So maybe it's a baud rate mismatch. And then once you have logged into the device, if you're going to configure it, we really recommend that you check the username and password that you're going to use in config-init, just to make sure it's going to log in okay. And then we also recommend that you verify the device IP address so that you can enter that when we run config-init. Once you do run that, if things don't seem to work, you can always use terminal shadow to observe what's happening. A lot of the times you can kind of figure out why it can't log in or transfer files using that. Show buffer is also really good for that. We keep a rolling buffer of everything that happens on the console port, so you can just kind of review, oh, hey, what went wrong here, using that. So that's what we recommend when you're configuring those devices. And now I'd like to get into the lab. We're doing good on time, so I think, so this unit, this local manager has about, I don't know, let's see, 16 plus 9. So this has 25 Cisco CSR 1000s on it. Each connected to Uplogix serial port. And as you can see, I've been in here messing around with this one a little bit. So this one's got an alarm on port 11. But basically, what we'll want to do for this lab is everybody's going to kind of pick a device. Maybe the best thing to do is to just pick one that corresponds with the lab instance you got. So if I'm 25, that's going to be the last one here. I'm going to be using port 2/9. So yeah, just kind of, pick a port, and what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to SSH to that port using the Uplogix terminal applet. You can use PuTTY if you prefer. You'll just have to type in the IP address up there from the control center here. And we're actually, yeah, I might say you get an error, but it should launch anyway. Or try it again, if not. We're actually going to want 2 SSH sessions so that we can kind of watch what's happening behind the scenes while we configure stuff. So, log in, it's going to be wwt user again and that same password. And it'll show you our dashboard with our 25 ports here. And you just want to go to that, whichever port, if you're lab instance 1, then you want this 1.1, right? If you're lab instance 5, you want port 1.5, so forth. This would be 17, 18, and down to port 2.9 for 25. So yeah, go ahead and just get a second SSH session going, and that's going to let us watch what's happening when we kind of run through this stuff. You can see what happens behind the scenes and so forth. I'm going to kind of put them just left and right here. Oh, and I'll need that password again. There we go. So if I go to that same port, 2.9, right? You can do various things, right? If you want, and probably everybody should just make sure this looks good. Just type terminal. Go ahead and get yourself in the console. Make sure you got the command line of that router. If you need to enable, these guys are configured to use that same password, right? So you can just enable with that same password, so forth. Tilde enter to exit from the terminal session. And you can see here, it's taking a moment to disconnect. It's basically backing up the running config during that process. So this is when, last week, second session, when we were talking about sometimes it takes our software a moment to give you back your command line. Usually it's because it's doing something like making a backup of your running config. Speaking of which, if you do a show directory, it should show you, you've got your current running config, your current startup config, and we have a standard OS image defined for these guys as well, using the OS policies feature that we were talking about. So, just to go back to our lab, if you want to look at the default jobs that we have configured, right, those backup jobs, show schedule is going to show you the currently scheduled jobs, right? You've got your pull running config, your pull startup config, backing up the VLAN.dat as well, and pull OS on this guy. If you need to, you can pull startup, right? Just pull start. It'll go ahead. It'll log in. In this case, it just did a quick MD5 check to make sure that it already had the current startup config. So that goes really fast. So, let's go ahead, while we're working with the command line, just to look at what that change logging looks like. If you terminal in, let's all just enable, right, using that same password from our cheat sheet on the desktop. And then let's all just change the host name. I'm gonna give it your name or whatever you want. Just something to identify it, right? A Thompson here for mine. Oh, host name. There we go. Write memory if you want or not, doesn't matter. And then oh, Shane, yeah, there's a there's a registration link to that Mark put out there. But yeah, if you want to just watch, that's fine. There's that link. So yeah, once we tilde enter to log back out, and if I do a terminal shadow here on the other screen, it's going to let us watch it do this backup here. It's pulling the running config right now. So there we go. We just missed it. There it is. It's doing that MD5 check to see if we still have the current running config. And because we don't, our software is automatically running that copy command. Hold that TFTP. So yeah. And on the left here, you can see, you know, I went ahead, I logged in, I made that config change there. And you can see once I log out, it goes ahead and it does a backup of that running config. Pardon. And then it's showing me, hey, these were the changes made in the current terminal session, right? The host name was this thing. We've got a minus, right? That's gone. And the host name is now this thing. You know, that shows up in your that's going to show up in your change logs. So if you do show device changes, right, it's going to show you, you know, when that happened. And if you show device change ID number 32846, that's going to show you specifically what was changed in there, right? And of course, this all rolls up to our control center, which, you know, amalgamates it into reports, so that you can, you know, kind of know who changed what when. Command. So that's, you know, some kind of basic, simple file operations with that. What I want to do next is actually do some auto recovery if everybody feels comfortable with that. For this lab, you know, we're going to open 2 SSH sessions, which we've already got. So the next thing I'd like to show you guys, everybody who's, you know, able to get into the labs, and, you know, everybody else, yeah, please just follow along. You know, I wanted to show you guys the configuration init process, right? This is when you first configure a port, right? So go ahead and try this on your own port. You can just type config init, and it's going to ask you, do you want to reinitialize it? Yes, you know, that's not going to hurt anything. So the description you can leave blank because it's going to automatically pick up the host name off the device, right? Make, again, you know, if you hit question mark here, you get a bunch of different options. But in this case, these guys are Cisco's, so you know, you can type Cisco or you can leave it because we've, you know, already got that value in here for this field, right? Model, it will automatically detect that as well. But again, OS, you have to tell it what version, right? In this case, we're running iOS. Or version number, you don't have to worry about that. It'll auto-detect that. But we do want to give it a management IP. That's going to help with those file transfers for our backups. So this device, this particular one, you know, we've already configured it. So, you know, you can just leave the existing value in there. And these routers don't have a console username or password, but they do have an enable password. That's probably that same, you know, password we're using for everything, but you can just leave what's in there because it's already been configured. And then, you know, you have the opportunity to enter secondary passwords. That's if you have maybe your TACACS or AAA for your initial, and then you've got to fail over to local for secondary. That's what these are for. And again, you can set the bit rate, but we've already tested it, and we know that that's right, so we don't need to change those. Good deal, James. So then, once you have entered all the information, you tell it yes, commit those changes. And then if you've got your terminal shadow going on the right, you can see it's going to do a bunch of stuff. You know, the first thing it's telling us is we're going to test your login. You know, make sure that it was able to log in. So it's logged out and it's waiting to see the command prompt. Now, you know, it's nothing slower than watching software time out, or, you know, a pot boil, right? But you know, sometimes we'll wait for a moment before we try again on a device, and that's kind of what we're seeing right here. So there you see it enter. It was detected that it was logged in, and then it enabled to make sure that it, is going to have the permissions it needs. Cool. So yeah, it's very useful if you are doing that initial configuration of a port and something doesn't seem to work right, right? You can use terminal shadow, or you can use, if I do show buffer here as well, that's our, where we record everything on the console port. So I've got, 475 pages of reviewable, what happened when we, did that configuration. And on the left, where you ran that config init command, you can see here it's going to show you everything that it found as it did its thing, right? First it did a login test, and that worked. So it basically ran a show version to pick up some of that other info, like serial number, that sort of thing. And then tests the scheduling of the backup jobs, right? The running config, the startup config. And then goes ahead and schedules all those jobs. If I do show schedule, I can verify we've got the right jobs scheduled. If I do show directory, I can verify we've got our configs backed up, we've got our OS image there. Now, these switches, these routers, you'll notice that they are unable to back up the config live off these systems. That's because we're in installed mode, and it can't pull them out of that. That's why we've used our standard OS feature here to stage that that backup image. Let's see here. It looks like I got disconnected too. There we go. Let me back in. So last lab, I'll let this load a little bit here, that we want to do is go ahead and get 2 terminal sessions going, have terminal shadow on one side, and then we want to run terminal in the other one. So, like I said, 2 terminals, two SSH sessions, and on one run terminal shadow, and on the other one we want to go ahead and terminal on in, and we're going to do something destructive now. We're going to go ahead and erase the startup config. So first I need to enable. I need to enter this password. And then, if you give it a show, no, I'm sorry, if you give it a dir flash, we can look at our dir flash. We can look at our file system, right? And what I want to do is go ahead and erase our startup config. Actually, I think I can just do erase flash. So we're going to erase the startup config. You have to confirm that. And then once it's gone, we want to go ahead and give it a reload, right? And this is just going to demonstrate what would happen if, let's say this router had bad memory and came up without its startup config. Or, maybe somebody accidentally erases the startup config. Either way, regardless of how you end up in that situation, our software is going to go ahead and try and automatically fix that. So I'm going to let it reload. And once it finishes with that, then I'm going to end my terminal session. And on the right-hand side, we're going to see, let's see here. I want to wait for it. Yeah, here we go. I'm going to let it start to boot. And I'm going to go ahead and log out at this point. I'm in my console session. And we're going to see on the right-hand side, it's going to continue to boot up there. And once our driver is able to access the command line, it's going to see that we have no startup config. Okay, so you can see on the right, there it is, it's booting up. Oh no, I'm just waiting for it to finish booting up here so it'll do its thing. Yeah. Luckily, this mostly happens when you're not watching it, and so it's not painful. So here it is, there it is, it's got to the initial system configuration dialog. And pretty shortly, our software should figure out that this thing doesn't have a startup config. That's one of the big triggers for that is that, you know, initial system configuration dialog. If I do show events, you know, once I exit out of that terminal session all the way, you know, it's saying here, hey, ended terminal session, and it was unable to capture the running config after I logged out, and that's because it was in the process of rebooting. There it is on the right. It's detecting partly because of that host name router that it needs to uh, grab that backup of the startup config and copy it over there. And so you can see here it's trying to figure out which version of the copy command is available. You know, in about another 30 seconds or so, probably it will go ahead and actually finish running that command to take our, you know, our startup config and copy it back to that router. There it is. It's going to try TFTP for that. Looks like. And it's even going to IP address gigabit Ethernet 0, so it can transfer that file that way. So our software, you know, is smart enough to try and configure that type of thing, so that we can, you know, restore these backups to it. And the same goes for the OS images. If you know, delete those OS images on the router, we'll go ahead and try and restore it using our backups the same way. So here it is. It's copied the file over. You see, it took it a couple tries, but it got it. And then it's now reloading that router so that that can go into effect. And so hopefully you were able to follow along with that at home. You know, it's just on the one hand side, you've got terminal shadow so we can see what's going on. And on the other side, you just terminal in and erase the startup config, and it will automatically take our backup and push it back to the router. You see that just took about, you know, 3 or 4 minutes there, all told.